make it easy for the hiring manager as well. The more you know about the job, which you get from that intake meeting often, the better candidates that you can present. And the more contracting you do in that intake meeting, things like, so I need to have 5 years of this kind of experience. Using statements like, so if I found somebody with 4 years of that experience, does that mean you do not want to see that person?
Don't conduct your analysis in isolation because data is so incredibly powerful.
Not defending just the tribe, but defending the organization.
Those creative people that you really want to keep empowered, keep excited, keep motivated, keep thinking.
A good experience pays dividends down the line.
Stereotypes tend to break down in proximity.
Welcome to We're Only Human, a podcast about human resources, business, technology, and the workplace. My name is Ben Eubanks, your host, and I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, welcome to We're Only Human. I'm so glad you're here with us. Looking forward to a fun conversation with Paul Norman. So Paul and I had a chance to meet a couple of years ago, face-to-face, like pre-COVID days, and he and I have stayed in touch. He's a TA leader, great experiences, lots of insight, and has had some pretty wild rides in his career. And so I'm so excited to have him here with us talking about TA strategy, some big picture ideas on what it takes to be successful. Trying to lump in all the stuff here, Paul, to make you give you a laundry list of stuff to cover. But before I do the rest of that, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Ben. I'm excited to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and your listeners.
For sure. Absolutely. Before we get to some of the fun stuff, TA and all the good things that entails, would you take a minute and tell the audience more about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to lead corporate TA teams most of my career in industries like financial services, technology, hospitality, and healthcare, both publicly and private equity funded environments. I've had small teams and then teams up to 300, my last company, 300 recruiters plus. Last fall, I transitioned full-time into a talent acquisition focused consulting firm called Riviera Advisors. Jeremy Eskenazi started that firm about 25 years ago. He's been a mentor of mine and a lot of his philosophies that I learned many years ago when I was new into TA really framed my career. So it's really cool to have the opportunity to work with Jeremy Riviera and that organization. We've got 8 consultants. We're all practitioners. So we didn't grow up as consultants. We're all ex-TA leaders who really have made a lot of mistakes and have a lot of knowledge to share. So we help organizations build stronger recruiting capability.
I tell everybody the things that I do right is because I did them wrong the first time. So it sounds like y'all are all willing to claim that as well.
100%. Yeah.
So this was not a question I planned to ask you, but I'm always curious when someone's had this long and amazing career in recruiting, what in the world convinced you to do that in the first place? Of all the things that you could have been, why did you get into the recruiting field?
Yeah, I think every person that I've met in recruiting, there's 2 in my entire career who said, I wanted to be a recruiter, right? So we all have the fall-in story. And in my fall-in story, I went to school. I have a biology degree from the University of Michigan. So I was going to be a scientist.
Makes for great recruiting, apparently.
Exactly. And in my senior year, I went to Mexico for the summer. So Yucatan, Mexico, August, not the best time to go, right? I was collecting fish, and so I was standing on Isla Mujeres on a muck-filled hole, collecting fish covered in mosquitoes and thinking, I don't think I want to do this when I'm 45, 50 years old. And so then I had the crisis because I was a senior, and I thought, what I'll do, I'll sell pharmaceuticals. No problem. I have a biology degree. So I interviewed for some of those jobs with a headhunting firm. And the headhunting firm said, hey, why don't you be a headhunter? And so I fell into recruiting by becoming a headhunter in the biotech pharma industry my first couple of years.
That's really, I'm imagining young Paul standing there covered in mosquitoes, just being stung and bit. And you're like, this is not gonna, no, I don't think
it's fine. It's fine when you're 20, but thinking forward, I'm like, this is not going to be good when I'm 45, 50 years old.
Oh, goodness gracious. And then there are probably some days when you were working as a recruiter or a TA executive where you're like, I just want to go back and pick up some dead fish whatever, pick up some fish and get stung by mosquitoes. And it'd be easier than what I'm facing right now. Okay, fine. Thank you for indulging that. I was curious. One of the things that I alluded to, and you hinted at like the size of some of the teams you've led, things like that. You've had some pretty incredible experiences working at companies where hiring was the lever for business growth. If we don't hire, we cannot hit these objectives we have as an organization.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit. What does it take for that kind of environment to be successful in that sort of environment where you're just dependent on the company's growth?
Yeah, I think my opinion is that hiring and being able to recruit people is always critical to business growth, right? You can't grow unless you can recruit and hire well. And so even when the business is contracting, right, there's always hiring. And I was in the financial services industry when there was a lot of contraction, there was a lot of M&A activity. And so there was a lot of making the business smaller, right? Closing sites. But that always led to site migrations, right? So you may be shrinking here, but then you're growing here. And so there's always recruiting activity. And the key thing that I found in my experiences and in the companies that we've worked with in the consulting space is you have to be connected and aligned to the business. Part of this is moving TA from a transactional order taking kind of organization to a business partner and a key business enabler. And this looks different at every company based on culture, TA's credibility, the current investment, where you start at. But I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean by that. Site migrations, right? This is a common thing that happens in recruiting. And some recruiting organizations get caught with here's what we're doing. We need you to staff up this new site in 2 weeks or in a month or in 6 weeks or whatever. So being part of the business and understanding more as a consultant what's happening allows you to have influence over this is how long it takes. This is what that market looks like. This is when we'd have to tell people on this side of that. This is when we'd have to start recruiting on the other side of that. M&A, another good example. We did a lot of M&A at my last company, at the PE funded company. And the business is really focused on finding the deal, closing the deal, getting it in, right? And then integration happens. And in businesses like the healthcare business I was in, where it's so people centric, you cannot grow that business unless you have nurses or caregivers or people to take care of the people, right, that the business is serving. The key thing was we had to make a seamless transition, right? As we migrated these companies or integrated these companies in, they still had to recruit. What website were they going to use? When are we going to move the technology over to our ATS and our CRM? What brand are we going to use? And there's a lot of passions typically, right, around employment brand and company names and things like this. How many people will we need to do that work? So M&A is another good example. I give you one more. Internal promotions were a really big topic at one of the companies I was at. And the reason was we did a lot of work to study people that moved into these general manager jobs, let's say, in a hospitality company, performed better than people we hired externally into those jobs. They got to productivity faster, right? It seems to make sense on the surface. And so we started measuring and putting goals in place for internal promotions. And we translated that into recruiting goals down to even the hourly employees that we were hiring into that business. And that was, we were looking for people that had the propensity or the potential to move up in their career fast. So instead of just hiring housekeepers or just hiring front desk agents that met the target for that job, we were actually looking for potential to move into leadership jobs, potential to move into the GM jobs. We used assessments to gauge that. And one kind of tool that we built over a number of years so that we could see when someone applied and interviewed for an entry-level hourly role, do they have the potential to move into ultimately a GM type of role? And then we actually measured that. And recruiting success metric was we wanted to have at least 10% 1 year of the new hires we made into those hourly jobs rated to have the potential to move into bigger jobs in the near future. And we looked at potential, and that's something the company got very mature at, talent reviews and ranking potential and moving talent throughout the organization.
I want to go back to a previous thing you mentioned, because I think there's a couple things you just dropped in there casually and walked on by like it's something that anyone could do. And I want to go back to a couple of those that I think were interesting. So you talked about being connected and aligned to the business. And you talked earlier about, I've been through this industry, that, like you were this litany of different industries. I would imagine when you go to a new industry, it's okay, let's relearn that some sort of thing like that. How do you get your footing, I guess, as someone who maybe is a leader or even someone who's a recruiter who steps into a new industry, right? It's not the same thing doing this in hospitality versus in healthcare. Talk about that transition a little bit and how someone else could get their footing or how you did that. So I think that'd be very practical and helpful here.
Yeah, I think the key that I found both in my career and then as a consultant is listening. You have to ask the questions. One of the things that we hear continuously in my short consulting career, but we hear it time and time again, is the business and the hiring managers want the recruiters and want TA to know what they do. They want them to know the business, and TA doesn't get credibility instantaneously. They have to understand what the business is doing, what the goals of the business are, and then determine what part of recruiting or what metrics or what things tie to those business goals, right? And as an example, in a high volume environment and a team we moved the goal from time to fill to percent staff to budget, because time to fill was really up to us. We got it to that point over a couple of years of where we looked at each market. We did the workforce plan based on attrition and how many heads they had at the end of a month versus what their budget said they needed. And there was some oscillation in that because we based that based on occupancy levels and occupancy projections. But the point is we tied recruiting metrics and plans and deliverables to the business, right? And what the business really cared about, they didn't really care ultimately if we filled that job in 5 days or 50 days. What they really cared about was, were they staffed fully, right? Because if they're not staffed fully, you couldn't clean a room and you couldn't get a family into their room. I give the example personally. We did a lot of travel with that company. It was a great perk. Yeah. And I had a very young family, right? 4 kids. You know the deal with kids. Mm-hmm. You're on an airplane. It's not an easy thing to go on vacation. You finally get to the hotel after a full travel day with a bunch of kids, and to be told the room's not ready is not a great start to your vacation. What are you going to do with 4 kids in a lobby of a hotel while they're waiting for the room to get ready?
I have found that they're very efficient once they see how destructive 4 kids can be.
There you go.
Like, suddenly that room's, this older couple here is sitting quietly. Your room's actually ready. Let's go ahead and get you scooted into that and out of here because you're blowing everything up in the lobby.
Staffing was what causes that. We didn't have enough housekeepers to get the rooms turned to get families in. Healthcare, you don't have enough therapists to get kids off the wait list to get them help. So it's really finding the business driver that recruiting connects to and then starting to work backwards. And if you start thinking about recruiting as what's the return on that investment I can produce. So it's not just to hire, and we stopped approaching the business in terms of all of these beautiful recruiting metrics that we all measure, and we look at the benchmark studies and we say, oh, we're better than the benchmark. Often I found the business doesn't care, right? The business needs what they need to deliver, whatever their business goals are. So finding the business goals. So it's learning the business, find what the business goals are, and then figure out how to align TA and the recruiting team to deliver on that. At a strategy level, you do that. But at an individual recruiter level, you do that as well, right? Recruiters can have conversations with hiring managers around what's important to your team. What are you trying to accomplish? If you don't have this person for 6 months because the search takes that long, what's the impact that will have? So it's those kinds of conversations back to being a consultant versus just saying, yes, I'll take the order and I'll work really hard to fill it in as fast as I can.
Yes. I love that. The second question I was going to ask you, you actually really, I think you crushed that one too. I was going to ask you about, let's say you come in, you have to build that credibility. I think you answered that one really well, talking about asking questions, building those relationships, understanding their hot buttons, their pain points, their issues, and not saying, I can reduce your time to fill by 4 days because they may or may not care. It's like an HR was like, we can get your engagement score up. And the CEO's, listen, I worry about profitability. I'm worried about business stability. I'm worried about competitors. Help me with those things. And so we got to translate it into something that actually matters to our leaders that they care about and give them some numbers there. That's excellent. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay. Any other things that you can think of that separate those companies that are successful at hiring at scale from those that might struggle with it? What sort of things really, for those that are killing it, what sort of things are they doing differently that those listening in here that have those high volume kind of needs could possibly mimic?
Yeah, I think in the high volume space, especially, and I think this translates to some of the niche space as well, but the high volume space, especially, make it easy. I think the companies that are winning are the ones that make it extremely easy. And easy meaning they've actually thought through through recruiting as a user experience type of exercise. And in my opinion, and what I've seen, the candidate is the primary user. Things have to be built from that first. Now, ATSs, and when we put these things in place, we often do it opposite, right? Like you go to a new company, you see an ATS, and you go, that was definitely built for the company or our needs, right? Or some legal thing. All good reasons, but candidate experience and candidate user experience is typically last. It's amazing to me that we're finally now getting to the point where applicant tracking systems are being built or configurable, where the first page isn't create an account, right? And do it again because everybody's using the same 3 ATSs, right? And so how many different accounts do you have? But it took us decades to get to that point because I don't think we really focused on the candidate as the primary user experience and running that all the way through. When I was recruiting for call centers, and now we're advising in these high volume shops, where are the candidates going to park if they actually have to come in for an interview day? And one call center I was working with, they're a big operation. They had a couple thousand people at this site. It's hot in the middle of Texas. It was 115 degrees here for like 100 days last summer. And you've got candidates that there's not enough visitor parking. So the candidates who come in have to park way at the end of the parking lot. By the time they reach the office, right, they're sweating and they're started this miserable experience. And so on interview days, we got the business to reserve 30 parking spots at the front. We put signage up welcoming. It's things like thinking through the full user experience of the candidate, not just the digital experience, right?
I'm glad you threw that in there because it's so much easier today to talk about all the tools and the technologies and all those things. And those do matter and those do play a big part in this. But when we have someone show up for a physical job interview or we have some of those kind of pieces of it, we sometimes forget that, hey, guess what? They're still a candidate up until the minute that they show up to accept that badge and start working that first day. Until that day, they're still a candidate, and how we treat them through all of that influences whether they're going to ultimately show up or not. They may have said yes to the offer even. We can't assume that still means they're going to show up on day one anymore. We've got to keep on recruiting them all the way up to that point. And thinking about things like that is a really good example. And goodness.
Yeah. Expense reimbursements, right? Another good example of kind of an outside of the recruiting space, but impacts the candidate greatly. If the candidate has their own expenses that they incur, especially if they're flying into an interview or whatever, they typically fall into one of two tracks, either the employee expense reimbursement process, often a once a month kind of process that built around corporate card timing, or they fall into a procurement kind of accounts payable process. Both are way too long for a candidate to get reimbursed, right? You want the candidate to be reimbursed like within a week max, not 30 days or 30, 60, 90 days on AP. Like those
the company alone here.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot to this experience. And then the secondary experience, in my opinion, is always the hiring manager. And how do you make it easy for the hiring manager? And then the tertiary, unfortunately, is recruiters. But recruiters, I've found, are typically not the best, not always the best thing, but recruiters are very adept at working in multiple systems. We've trained recruiters probably by accident. That happens, right? They have to sometimes do that. If it's for a good reason, meaning it provides an exceptional candidate user experience, I do that all day long. The golden, like the perfect thing would be wired right down the middle and thread the needle so all three user groups have the best experience that can be delivered. It takes a while to get there, I found.
You gave us some really good things on the candidates and some things that were beyond what I even expected, honestly. I love that. We all know the recruiting angle because many of us either serve in that role or work a lot right alongside them. They're at the next desk over, all those kind of things. The hiring manager piece is one, though, that I haven't really delved into much here in the past. And I was curious, do you have Any suggestions, any tips? Like, hey, here's one of the things we did to get them on the same page with the recruiting team, or here's an idea to help them be more effective at selection, or whatever it is. I don't know. If you have anything in your back pocket that you've seen be effective at helping your hiring managers level up, because some of the headaches we have come because there's this mismatch and disconnect, or they're expecting something that it's impossible to deliver all of those things and get them to accept $1 a year in pay. I'm sorry, we're going to have to find some other way around this. What sort of suggestions might you have on that front?
Yeah, what we find is that it starts with this contracting, consulting, kind of consultative mindset, right? Where you have good recruiting organizations have an intake meeting. And the intake meeting is a lot about setting the right expectations. I'm going to do this, right? I need you to do this. This is what you can expect from me. This is what I expect from you. Here's the SLAs that we're going to put in place for our partnership, right, on hiring this role. So I think it starts with that. And there are ways to make it easy for the hiring manager as well. The more you know about the job, which you get from that intake meeting often, the better candidates that you can present. And the more contracting you do in that intake meeting, things like, so I need to have 5 years of this kind of experience. Using statements like, so if I found somebody with 4 years of that experience, does that mean you do not want to see that person? Maybe not. I'd like to see them. Yeah, so you start to quantify
that range.
Yeah, and that makes it easier for the hiring manager because they're seeing less people. You're gaining credibility with them. You're sending people that hit the mark because you've helped define the mark versus just, I've sent you the job description, just use that. So that's a key piece, is this contracting up front. And then I think on the other side is, once you establish SLAs, building accountability. This is more on the strategy piece for TA leaders, but if you can build accountability that's automated so that the bad news comes from the machine or the report instead of the recruiter. And so we've done a lot of automation in my past of reporting that showed how many candidates are in play or in a hiring manager's hands, how long they've been there. And it really has taken the heat off of that recruiter having to go to the manager and say, hey, you've got 5 people that have been in your hands because if it's just in an automated report that happens weekly, and it's always happened weekly, it's transparent, it's there. The bad guy is the report instead of you transfer, right? And you increase that accountability. That's been really helpful. But again, you have to be aligned to the business, right? You have to have the initial relationships. You have to gain the credibility and contract around those things to have the SLAs in place. And then you let the reporting manage a piece of this.
I've never stopped to think about the intake meeting like you were talking about a second ago. Usually it's just tell me about the role, what sort of skills are important, what's requirements. We get those things and we just write it all down, we put it out there on a rack. But some of the things you were talking about there, as simple as, tell me, I want to be sure on this. If I bring you a candidate that's slightly below that required threshold, here's a number, and just making that more clear to them, because then it's really easy. As a very basic sales tactic, if they tell you yes, later on they're going to be consistent with that. They're going to say, oh yeah, I did tell you that was okay. Okay, this candidate doesn't have something else, but you at least were doing what I asked you to do. And being a little bit more of a interactive dialogue versus a question, answer. Okay, great. That could have just been a text message thread back and forth and be done. But we're actually having a little bit more of a conversation around this. You're calling it contracting. I love that sort of approach there. That really gives the recruiter some more confidence to stand on, that they know exactly what they're looking for and they have a range, versus I've got to throw the dart. And if it doesn't hit this exact target, I'm going to be a complete failure. And they're going to say no to everybody. And like that creates a weird dynamic in the relationship. So I think that's really insightful there. So for those out there that are trying to hire today, you've already given them some good ideas, some suggestions on thinking about these different personas in the process. You talked about some of the other things it takes to be successful. Anything else that you're like, this is one of the top of mind things that I think is important, especially today when you're hiring, you've got to keep this in mind or you're going to really struggle?
Yeah, on a strategy side, one of the things that is really common is an undefined process. And that's really difficult to do things like establish SLAs and build a contracting consulting type of relationship. So nailing down a recruiting process, and that doesn't mean it has to be firm and there's nothing that can change from a local or regional perspective, but doing the work to actually set the guardrails around what is our process and what are the things that we're going to say, absolutely not. You can't color outside that line. We're going to do this. That's a key thing. And it's interesting how hard that is. The companies I've been in and the companies I see in the consulting space, we spend a lot of time on the process. And look, everybody's special and everybody's unique, and every hiring manager has the kind of terminal uniqueness of, but my role is different, right? And my department is different. And there's a lot of truth to some of that, but there's also a lot of value in getting a clear, consistent baseline process. We're always going to do this. Recruiters are always going to do screens before we send over. We're not going to just send over every single person who applied. That enables, as a recruiter, it really gives you freedom to say no, because you're going to have the support because this has been agreed upon in the organization, or it gives you a path to have an exception. But an exception meaning an exception, not an exception mean the exception is the rule, right? Every single person is an exception. We see a lot of cultures of optionality in many companies where that's just the culture. I have the option to participate or not. And mature TA organizations and mature recruiters have enough confidence to say, that's fine. If you don't want to participate as a partner, then you can do it yourself.
Best of luck. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's bold. I have been in organizations and I've seen organizations where that has been where we've gone, where we've said, you know what, you can manage your own recruiting. And that's actually better for the business because maybe they are that unique and maybe they have a different way of handling it, or maybe they're just not culturally or organizationally ready to come over to a more centralized process. That's okay. I think as TA leaders, we get hung up on it has to be one way or the other way. It has to be all RPO or no RPO. It has to be all centralized or completely field in the business. Yes. And that's not really the right answer typically. We find a lot of companies where we're recommending build this to be a centralized function or shared service, build these things to actually report to the business. It depends on the culture. It depends on where the company is. It depends on what's important to that organization, tied to the best way for them to get their business goals accomplished.
It seems to me that to have that sort of boldness, maybe the word you said a minute ago, like when you're like stand up as the TA, professional TA leader and say, all right, if you don't want it our way, then you're welcome to do it, whatever. That can only come from a place of strength. It's because we're hitting our goals. It's because we're doing the things right over here. It's because we've got some backing, because we've got proven performance. You can't show up on day one and say, oh, well, do it. And you can do what you want to, then fine. Like you've already shown up saying, listen, we've done this for all these other dozens of hiring leaders across the entire organization. Great results. Look at this track record. Now, if you want to do something different, that's okay. But you're saying no to that, so you can say yes to this other thing. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think the key is back to listening.
Yeah.
So I think mature TA leaders, mature recruiters listen, and then think back to my role as a TA leader isn't to have the best TA metrics, right? So I can go to a conference and brag about it. My goal as a TA leader is to help the business accomplish what they need to get accomplished as a business. And if the best way to do that is to outsource this function or this piece of the function, or let the business do these things, or centralize this or not centralize that, if that's the best way to get that accomplished, and that's really hard, that comes after many years, right? Mm-hmm. And many battle scars of not doing it that way. So this is probably one of those lessons learned by pain. But there are companies and cultures and organizations where centralized TA isn't the right answer. It just doesn't work in that culture. There are companies where an employee referral program would be the best thing for us to recommend to them. And then there are companies where an employee referral program would never work because culturally they just wouldn't buy into it, or they don't need it, or so on. I think the key is back to listening. So I don't know that you have to have a position of strength. I do think you have to have a position of let me actually listen, and then have enough guts to say, this is what I think the right way to accomplish our goal together is as a business. And that I found gives you more credibility than if you're fighting to be right all the time.
Love that. I'm thinking about all of the lists of here's the skills that matter for TA leaders, everything else. You're like, all these things are very functional and focused on the domain specifically. Like, listen, if we listen first, if we're actually using our ears and we're picking up on the cues the business is giving us, that's going to be the best thing we can do, more so than any other using this specific tool or having this specific strategy or this thing we're sharing from a stage somewhere. Like, great case study, but it all comes back to success, comes back to listening well, and then deciding what you can and can't support there. Excellent. Man.
All of those are important, right? You have to have the tools in your tool bag.
Yeah.
To be able to bring the strategy and say, okay, we're going to employ this and this. You have to process is a big piece of it, but then technology layers in. There's a lot of us, myself included, because this TA Tech is amazing. I love HR Tech is my favorite conference because I get to see all the new toys. And I think most of us as TA leaders and even recruiters go, wow, that's cool. Let's plug that in and it'll solve everything. Versus going, what do we need to solve? And then finding the tool to solve that. So there are other pieces of this. So you have to have competence in the skill and the expertise in recruiting, and then understand what the technologies can do and how you can leverage those into your process or tweak your process to take advantage of technologies that are emerging. But I do think you have to have enough business acumen and listening to figure out, how do I tie TA into what the business needs to get accomplished? And then how do I employ all those tools and skills and things that I've learned in the craft of talent acquisition to be successful?
Probably shouldn't drop your microphone because that would not be good for it, but that would be the mic drop moment right there to wrap us up. I love that. And I appreciate you for giving us all these great ideas. I asked you to be practical and you knocked it out of the park there on that one, Paul. So if someone wants to follow you, wants to connect with you, is LinkedIn the best way?
Yeah, LinkedIn's a great way, or just give me a call, 407-484-8059.
Oh, wow. There we go. I think it's the first phone number that's been dropped on the podcast ever. So there's a new one for everybody out there. I'll make sure you get your link into your LinkedIn connection into the LinkedIn profile link into the show notes so people can reach out, connect with you there. Seriously, appreciate you for joining me, for spending some time with us here, for giving us some ideas of what's possible when we're doing these things the right way. And it gives me a lot of confidence in you and the team there as you're supporting up companies that are doing this kind of thing. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. To everybody else out there, hope you got some good notes, some good ideas on how to scale up your function, how to support the business, how to align and partner, how to, most of all, listen for the right cues so you can be as effective of a TA partner as possible. We'll catch you again next time on We're Only Human. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm honored to have you as a listener. If you enjoyed this episode, please take 10 seconds to rate it at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Also, if you know a friend that could benefit from today's conversation, please pass it their way. After all, a rising tide lifts all ships. To see show notes, sponsor information, and our full show archives, visit onlyhumanshow.com.